Greetings, everyone. This is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and today's video is going to be Torath Mosheh and the theory of evolution. So the first thing, getting into this topic, is a question that person can ask. What does Torath Mosheh have to say about evolution? And I'm going to pretty much warn you up front that, there's a lot of different views that one can come to. And part of what you see in this video is just some of the views that I've either, kind of picked up on my own, that I develop on my own, and that I'm still developing on my own. And it's for the same reasons that there are elements of this situation that we call, in English is called evolution, that often has challenges, questions, and things like that that come along with it. So one of the things that's important to note is a Jew who holds by Torath Moshe, there is a commonality between all ancient Jewish communities that hold by the Torah, and the first one being the national revelation at Mount Sinai, meaning that the source of creation, the source of all reality that itself is not sourced from something else, basically appeared to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai and made everybody, as you would say in English, prophets. And then essentially that the Torah was given at that point, in which after a certain period that produced both, the written Torah and is the source of all oral Torah. And what this means is that essentially, when we talk about the Jewish understanding, what I call Torath Moshe, and when we deal with this topic, I'm going to be approaching it from someone who, the claim that we have historically is that the creator of all things made this happen and provided certain details. But that the Torah itself, the written Torah, for example, is not a science book, in the way that most people would address science, in the Western world. And it's not a history book in the way that people address history. One way that I always tell people is that it's almost like saying it's the commentary of the source of creation to the Jewish people. And that commentary is not there to try to specifically detail everything that we would consider to be scientific thought or even, historical thought, but more to provide a framework or a background with, all different elements that are related to what the Jewish people will need to progress throughout society. So it's like saying it's the foundation of how we develop ideas and how we develop ourselves in this world and how we research the reality that's around us, because that's an important part of it. That, there's elements of saying, okay, the Torah is not one of these religious answer books that people sometimes think where it's supposed to provide all the answers to everything, where it's more like saying it provides a foundation for the Jewish people to deal with the reality that's around us and to research and in many cases find answers, for ourselves of how to deal with reality and how we look at reality. And that's going to be reflected in this video. So as I've mentioned in the other video I did about science, the basic issue that one principle that can be found in the Khuzarim is this idea where it basically talks about that the Torah was not given to, basically, go against what is seen and proven to be true. Now, again, the important elements that the Kuzari describes, in this area is that we're dealing with things that are proven and seen to be true, not things that we consider to be the best explanation, for example, because there's some situations where we may feel that something explains something to the best of our ability, but someone else could come back in a later generation and say, well, your explanation is nonsense. I mean, again, you did the best you could for your time. You were limited by your technology and your insight into the situation. But essentially, what you consider to be true is not true. And that's what say the Torah is not, given to contradict what is seen and proven to be true. And this is something that we say, would be something that's a constant, that no matter how many times it's tested, it comes back upon itself. Now, there may be some elements of the Torah that contradict what we think the reality to be, or what we think to be, the historical reality or even the scientific reality, but it's not there to, contradict what is proven and seen to be the reality. So, one important element when dealing with this question of evolution, and specifically the English concept of it, meaning what the Western world has defined the word evolution to mean, and what exists within the Western thought about the concept. One of the things that's important concerning the Torath Moshe perspective is what we call as part of the Masorah, and that there is this concept of time, that the concept of time was not created yet when the Torah says that, for example, Wahi Erev, Wahi Boker, Yom Echad. Now, in English, you're probably used to hearing the idea that there are like 6 days of creation, for example. Now, as I mentioned in the previous video about like the age of the universe, that essentially, you could look at the Torah in the Hebrew text as being more allegorical more than anything else, meaning that when it talks about those, elements of, the, creation, if you will, or in English you say the creation story, that it is not describing a time frame in terms of the time of like day one, day two, the way we look at 24-hour days, but more of like the foundations of reality that are important and concerning to this idea of the commentary of the creator of all things. So when we deal with the first day, Usually people read it in English are used to it being that there was this and that first day, this and that second day, this and that third day, fourth day, fifth day, sixth day, seventh day. But in the Hebrew text, it doesn't say first day, it says Yom HaHot, which would translate into one day. Now, the question, as I mentioned in other videos, is some people could ask, why does it say one day rather than first day? And then it goes one day, second day, third day. And one of the reasons that's given is that this is not describing a time frame in terms of time, meaning hours, days, years, things like that, epochs, but more of a foundation. And that essentially Hashem existed and all the other potentials for reality were established by Hashem and allowed to break down and, basically and come back and exist, and then like this thing. It's basically like there's midrash that talks about that Hashem created and destroyed worlds, if you will, meaning if you will realities until the current one. And there's some elements of that would also require some speculation as well as investigation. But one of the ideas is that when we deal with Yom Ahad, it's not just dealing with, like, for example, one, a day, as we said, but more like it's a stage in reality, and that there are lots of things that happen. And there are even some sources, within the Jewish community that, basically talk as if there were like lots of things happening on one, on Yom Ehod, meaning that it could have been billions of years, if not trillions of years, before you get to the point of what's relative to modern day man. And that's one of the things that is important. That when you deal with the way Bereshit is addressing things, it's addressing it from what's important to modern day man from a Jewish perspective. So this would mean that there's nothing problematic in the Jewish concept of the Torah, with an idea that, everything that it took to make the universe what it is, in the initial stages of it, if you will, and those that, if you will, predate man or predate modern man, could have easily been a part of what was considered Yom HaHoth, the foundations of those things being built rather than a time frame. And that we know that, within reality, everything, develops based upon the will of Hashem, the will of the creator of all things. But, there are mysteries to us, about how that develops because we weren't there to see it. Especially, given the fact that most humans, not modernly, will only live potentially to, past one, a little bit past 100s of years. But then when you talk about billions of years, potentially even hundreds of years, no human beings ever experienced that. So to try to go into every detail of what could have happened within a certain time frame of creation, from detail to detail, that's beyond the realm of humanity. But we can always research it and try to do the best we can and use the best explanation for it that we have in any generation. So this would also include, how life came about itself, and how what we consider to be life and what we define as life within, our own definitions. What is the best estimation of how those things happen? And from the Torah-based perspective, is like, what's the best evidence based on existence of how Hashem either caused it or allowed it to happen? Knowing that the fact that the creator of all things is not a human being, doesn't have a body like a human being, and exists beyond humanity and beyond our universe, and that, when we say the words we use is often using the language of men to try to describe something that is beyond us and something that we, for example, don't always have all the details about. But we are allowed to come to whatever conclusions we can based upon the current information. So, as I mentioned before, there's a number of text within Jewish writings for the last few thousand years that discuss this idea that before, here you see in the Hebrew Adam Rishon, and this is just a representation I pulled out of kind of a comic book, that the first human being before, if you will, eating, the whole story of eating the fruit, the fruit of the tree of, like, the knowledge of good and evil. In Hebrew it's a bit more detailed than that, but I'll just use that terminology for for the sake of this video, that the first human Adam Rishon, or Ad Adam, and then people call in English Eve, which are actually named in Hebrew according to the text with Hawa, that before they ate of the fruit, their nature was different than the current nature of humanity, currently. And that's one of the things that's mentioned in Adorat Eliyahu, concerning this commentary on Genesis, or the text of Bereshith, as it's mentioned in Hebrew. Um, that the essentially before Adam Rishon, there were other generations that existed. Now, one of the numbers that's given is about 974. But again, we always look at that and say, okay, well, Midorashim, we don't have to take them literally. It could be that they're making bigger points than just, that. And it could be that when you say generations, well, what exactly is the measuring point for a generation? Is it something that is modern day human, or is it something that could predate humanity? And one of the things that we learn from Chazal that we don't know exactly what existed before Adam Rishon. That's information that the Creator of all things did not, give to us through a tradition that that has continued to this day and time. It could be that through our own intuition and our own investigation we could find out those things, and it could be that it's way beyond us, to the point where we wouldn't know in this lifetime, for example. But it's something that does exist, so that there is a definition or distinction, I should say, between what I would call from Adam Harishon to modern day man, meaning that there's a modern sense of humanity, and that there was like some element of what we could call humanity beforehand, but it also could be that our like linguistics are not sufficient to describe what would have existed beforehand, and that there is some element of what we call in Hebrew Kabbalah to this whole idea. Basically meaning that there are some concepts that are kind of beyond the scope of what we normally learn and what we normally hear, and requires research to understand exactly what the reality is. So then getting into this idea specifically, what is considered to be by some people evolution, and I use some of the graphics kind of like as tongue in cheek a bit. I mean, I'm not trying to take every little graphic literally, because one of the things I have found in this kind of discussion is often when you have people who call themselves or are called creationist, which usually is a term used to mean Christians, who are kind of debating for the Christian position, versus atheists. I've kind of found that there's funny business on both sides in terms of kind of playing with what the information says and what it doesn't say, playing with what research actually says and what it doesn't say, and not kind of like, accepting that there could be, some ground that, requires a person to say, well, I don't have all the facts. I'm just going to accept whatever is considered to be reality. And that, from the Torah-based perspective, is how we deal with the reality, that we don't have to like, get stuck in certain stances. There's certain things we know. We know about the creator of all things. We know the creator of all things placed us in reality. We know that the Torah, the creator of all things gave the Torah, but there's other details about how, how the creator did certain things, or how things progressed historically unto this time, that are, can be up for debate. So to that point, there's a number of sources from, the rabbis, Chazal, that detail the type of genetic link between humans, apes, and monkeys, and even extinct species. And one of those species that, in certain Chazal, they called it Adonai HaSadeh, that were similar in appearance to both humans and apes. And there's a number of sources, like in the Talmud, and also the Rambam mentions it in his commentary in the Mishnah, and the Zohar mentions it, and there's a wealth of sources that talk about this. And one of the things that has to be made distinction-wise is that in English, for example, in modern English, we have all these distinctions that have been created, for human, ape, monkey, things like that. And those definitions change over time, but there is no like set definition of these terms that came down, from the sky, if you will. Um, so it's basically like humans creating human language to describe things around us. So one of the things that Chazal do mention is that they mention, as if like, from either speculation or whatever, a link between, humans, modern humans, and some ancient extinct, species that seem to be both either human or ape. And the word that they would often use for something that was like not human but was similar to a human would be a kof. And then like, this idea that, is mentioned that, for example, modern humans have some connection to those, those species, and that there may have been something beforehand, but we all are very honest about the fact that there's elements of that are, up in the air until, research, and until something shows us what the truth is. We only have certain elements of it, and we're not expected to have those details. So then let's get into the basics of the theory of evolution. And this is where I say that I sometimes find that both, in the creationist versus atheist argument, both sides sometimes seem to play loose and fast with the facts, so to speak. So I want to kind of cover it from the perspective I have about the whole thing, at least. So if once years ago, when I was trying to put this together and I thought about doing this video, my views about how to present it, and also my views about what I consider to be the best facts out there. Okay, but I looked at like a site called Live Science just to get the westernized definition of the term evolution, especially concerning what's called the theory of evolution. So essentially, what Live Science had on it at one point was the theory of evolution by natural selection, first formulated in Darwin's book The Origin of Species in 1859, is the process by which organisms change over time as a result of changes in hereditable physical and behavioral traits. Okay, so that's a very basic definition of the term. And one of the reasons I bring that up as being basic is because One of the things that often comes up whenever creationists and atheists argue is that often people focus on Darwin as if he was the first person and is like the source, the modern day source for all concepts of evolution, when in reality, he wasn't the first person to come up with some of the ideas that he had. He was maybe one of the first person to publicize, that got the, if you will, world attention to some of the ideas he had from the research that he performed. But it's important to note that it was research that he was performing in a particular location, and he was writing down his ideas about that research during that time. And that, the concept of the science of, the biology and things like that has progressed since his time. So there are some elements of, what he wrote in The Origin of Species that has kind of been disregarded, and there's some things that have considered to be have repeated upon themselves and been found to be something that's correct, until, for example, until it's overturned. So going kind of more into more details about this live science site says changes that allow an organism to better adapt to its environment will help it survive and have more offspring. And then they get into a little bit more details about this, where it says the theory has two main points, said Brian Richmond, curator of human origins at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. All life on Earth is connected and related to each other, and this diversity of life is a product of modifications of populations by natural selection, where some traits were favored in an environment over others. Now, one of the things I want to point out is one of the reasons I think that this debate between the creationist, specifically the Christian style creationist, and atheists who are or people who consider the evolution to be true, is sometimes by the definition of the terminology. So one of the things I can tell you up front, just kind of taking an outsider position to both sides, that I could tell you that a creationist would latch onto is the statement that's made here. All life on Earth is connected and related to each other, and this diversity of life is a product of modifications of populations by natural selection, where some traits were favored in an environment over others. And it's this terminology that often brings the argument of, okay, when you say that something's favored, what's doing the favoring? When you say that something, is, modifications of populations by natural selections, it gives the impression as if you're saying that something's doing something, that natural selection isn't just some concept or, an explanation, but that instead there's some element of reality that's actually causing, if you will, using this bad example here, one thing to change from this to this to this to this to that. And therefore, those changes are saying that something intelligent was behind the changes, or else they wouldn't change the way that they're changing. Why not? Why couldn't this be the change, for example, from, like if you will, dinosaurs to lizard people? And or, what the concept of this animal all the way to this animal, or backwards, if you will, for example. Um, and this is where I think that, an honest kind of approach would look at this and say, look, these are all terms. This is all the verbiage, that people create in order to explain something. But it doesn't mean the verbiage is, sufficient in some cases. And it doesn't always mean the verbiage means what someone else wants it to mean. So from what I understand, I've read somewhere that Darwin, for example, didn't like some of the language he felt he was forced to use to try to explain his ideas. And that it sometimes, in some cases, gave a different view of what he was trying to say than what he was making, meaning that someone could use his words and come to some conclusions that were incorrect. And maybe you could say on either side. And again, that's just my understanding of like some of the issues he had. So continuing, it says, more simply put, the theory can be described as descent and modification, said Brianna Poberner, an anthropologist and educator of the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., who specializes in the study of human origins. The theories are sometimes described as survival of the fittest, but that can be misleading, Poberner said. Here, fitness refers not to an organism's strength or athletic ability, but rather the ability to survive and reproduce. So this if this is the basic definition, I would say from a Torah-based perspective, there's nothing wrong with this idea. I mean, basically, the Torah talks about survival. The Torah talks about, progression. And the Torah talks about the idea of, if you will, natural selection. Specifically, there's things in the stories in the Torah that deal with this idea of, making sure that something is fit to move and progress or modify in a certain way, specifically towards like human beings. And even the idea that animals, have that ability too, but on a different level than humans do. So I don't feel that there's a problem with this from a Torath Mosheh perspective. I think where the problem could come in is when someone presents their, ideas or opinions as being fact, rather than saying, okay, well, this is the my personal belief of what the best explanation is based on the fact, based on the results. Where someone could say, well, okay, my idea of the results is this instead. So sometimes the conclusions that people draw about something could be where the disagreement is from a Torah-based perspective, not as much the idea. Because, for example, I don't have a problem with the idea that I'm an evolved state, or by natural selection, my parents being married and producing me produced me. And I'm an evolved state of my parents. I don't have a problem with saying I'm an evolved state of my grandparents, and I don't have a problem with saying that I'm an evolved state of all my ancestors from about 1,000 years ago or more, or or further. There's nothing wrong with that because to me that makes sense. With every marriage, with every production of children that survive, all of it leads to me, and that's an evolution of each generation to me, if you will. And meaning knowing that the term evolution just basically means change, if you will. So another important element that would have to be discussed and looked at is the fossil record, because one of the ideas you could have in terms of debate and discussion about this is we find something in the ground, just like we have here, and I'll get into this later in the video. And the question is, okay, I find some bones. What does that mean exactly? What does that exactly say? And the further away from modern history, these things I find in the ground are, the harder it is, to really say exactly what it is, we're looking at, and what does it mean exactly. And that's what's mentioned in this particular article from the Science how to stuff, or how stuff works website, where it says the fossil record, however, is quite incomplete. Here's the major reason why. Sediment has to cover an organism's remains in order for the long fossilization process to begin. Most organisms decompose before this can happen. Fossilization odds increase if the organism happened to exist in large numbers or lived in and around sediment. Okay, and then going to the other highlighted parts, factors in all the fossils we haven't uncovered with factor in all the fossils we haven't uncovered with the ones we can't decipher properly due to partial fossilization or insufficient technology, and the fossil record gets even spottier. And this could even happen, like he's saying, we could find more information and then be confused about what it is that we're seeing because of the fact that when we had a limited idea, we may have had like a limited view. And there's nothing wrong with that being the case. I mean, you can only go by what you have. And then it continues, it says the fossil record grows more incomplete the further back in time we attempt to look. Organisms that are more recent don't appear either. For example, freshwater mollusk in the class Bivalvia suffer up to 45% incompletion in some classes. Important links in the fossil record also remain unaccounted for, such as the ancient last common ancestors connecting entire phyla. Research into the fossilization process continues to illuminate just how much of the fossil record we're missing. So this is something that's practical and it makes sense. I mean, again, there's no guarantee that anybody is going to find, the fossils of something that existed thousands of years ago or millions of years ago. I mean, there's no guarantee that it's survived. There's no guarantee that every place that you search, you're going to find something, because a lot of times you're looking for like a needle in a haystack, in some cases. So now I want to get into, the way I approach this from a Torath Mosheh perspective, and that gets into research and questions. So the first thing I look at is I say terminology. When I'm looking into these issues, I look and say, okay, what do the terms mean? What does the terminology mean? And this is the same thing I did earlier with the idea of, evolution and a little bit with natural selection, but now I'll get into a little bit deeper dive of why that's important. So when we deal with, the idea of evolution, one of the best explanations I heard about that in the connection with natural selection is that evolution deals with change, but natural selection deals with how that change actually takes place. So if we look here, this is a good example that I found of, you have a situation, let's say, where you have different types of mice that are different, born different colors. They exist at the same time, but that there's certain mice that if they can blend into the environment better, it's a higher likelihood that they'll survive from predators that can that they're camouflaged from, rather than ones that have less camouflage. So what can happen over time is that even though it's not like magically poof, these mice appear out of nowhere, but it's more like saying that at some point the ability for predators to get to the ones that don't blend into the environment will reduce that population so that the majority becomes the population that can blend into the environment and thus mate and survive. Where the other ones who are easily, more easily picked off will basically decline in those environments. Now, of course, that can change if the environmental factors change, and that the environmental factors as well as other, things factor into what can survive and what doesn't survive. And that's, the element of, natural selection, based in a very general way. Another way, way of looking at it, was the research that Darwin did about, the idea of finches and beak size, and how beak size can affect, what's able to survive in the location that he was researching. Meaning that, as I mentioned in another video, that you could have a situation where a mutation creates variation, but that there are certain mutations that are not favorable to an environment. So you could have one type of beak that is good for like, doing, things like seeds and things like that. Another type of seeds, beak that's good for buds and fruits, grubs, tool using, insects and leaves. Take these, different types of sizes, put them in different environments, and the result could be that only certain types of, of birds are able to survive based upon what they're born with. And then the more that the ones that are born with different the variations that are not, as good for surviving in that environment, they'll be the less likely to, pass on their genes to future generations. So what can happen is that the gene pool that allows for them to have, like, let's say a longer beak dies out because of the fact that it isn't able to survive. Now, the other thing that has to factor into this is that you could easily have a bird that, let's say, looks like this, producing any one of these birds, in a, I guess in a clutch. I don't know what to call the term for it, but they could have babies that have, basically these variations. But if the environment only favors, let's say, this type of beak, then this is going to be the one that's going to probably be the most or the majority. And, in every generation where the other ones are born, they won't survive. But again, that's looking at it from a very, small kind of scale, try to understand the concept itself. It doesn't mean that, for example, the DNA erases everything else. It just simply means that, for example, in some scenarios that, certain genes are not passed on, one, or B, that the genes are passed on, but simply that the ones that are born with a variation to, what is survivable just simply don't survive. Therefore, depending on when a person does the research, they may not see those things. So these are the kind of questions that, could pop up, in a discussion about this topic. One question is, okay, what is natural about selection? And what I mean by that is if we're going to use terminology, even if, a person says, look, I don't mean that nature is choosing something or selecting something, the question then would be, well, why choose the terminology at all? And again, it gets to the same point I mentioned about the Torah, that at some point we have to say something. At some point I have to use terminology. So this is the terminology I'm using. This is what it means. But then the next question I could say is, for example, historically, what jump started the entire process? Meaning that let's go beyond the species themselves. When we get into the environment itself, which plays a factor, if you will, in the concept of evolution, what caused the environment to even exist, to be able to allow life to exist? Not only that, what factors cause those things, those, if you will, those seed materials or seed elements of reality to exist, to even be able to give the ability for there to be life? Then another question would be, what established the limits of what is possible? Meaning that if I have, like, let's say, a starfish, does the starfish have the ability to evolve into a hummingbird? Does a hummingbird have the ability to evolve into a snail? And if the answer is no, that means that there's limits on what's possible. And if so, what establishes the limits? I mean, if I have a single cell organism, for example, if you take a single cell organism and get to a hummingbird, that's a huge jump between that and that. It doesn't mean it's impossible for it to happen. It just means that I have questions about how it happened and why. Now, there's some people would say, well, okay, well, there's elements of science that don't explain why. But I'm saying, okay, that's fine. I don't have a problem with some of the tools I'm using don't give me the ability to explain why, but I need to know why in order to come to certain types of conclusions. Not all of my conclusions, but certain conclusions. So if I'm asking why, because I want to know why, and there's nothing wrong with wanting to know why, and there's nothing wrong with saying, well, hey, look, the tool bag doesn't allow you to know why. There's a different tool bag for that. So it's like saying if I do research in the lab research may never tell me what it would take to go from a single cell organism to a hummingbird, because potentially I may not have the ability to cause those kind of factors to happen. It could be that there are factors that happen in history millions of years ago that caused that ability to happen in this, particular stretch or that stretch, but that I don't have the ability to force those things to happen, and I don't have the ability to see those things happening because I won't live to see the results, if you will, from, that kind of change. It could be that it's just literally impossible for that to have happened that way. It could be that what I think happened didn't happen. I mean, there's a lot of things because we're dealing with historically what happened and what established the limits of what happened. And again, someone could say, well, you're just trying to say that, let's say, in the English sense, that a God caused it to happen. I'm like, not saying that because, again, as a Torath Mosheh Jew, we say that the source of creation gave us the Torah, and we are saying that that's the reason why we know that there's a source of creation because of the mass revelation at Mount Sinai. I'm not saying it because I look at nature and I say because of this, there must be something that created everything, because it could be that nothing created anything. But it just brings the question of, well, what, again, again, how did all this get started? What started the process that allowed any of these things, even theoretically to happen? And it's important. And someone may say, well, okay, well, look, we don't have the ability to go back that far. And I'm like, my thing would be, okay, fine, let's just be honest that we don't know. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with not knowing. It's not like I would say that, oh, science doesn't know. Well, science is a concept. It's more like saying we as humans don't know because we don't have the ability to know right now, and potentially a future generation might know, or it could be that it's beyond humanity to ever know. So then getting a little bit more into the idea of, because I think one of the arguments that people make is this idea that people just want to say, okay, well, I don't descend from a monkey. Well, again, it's kind of a tough thing to even discuss because when you look at genetics, there's a lot of different animals that you can say have like a close genetic, if you will. I guess there's some genetic equivalents, in terms of genes, with other, animals that exist in reality. And again, this is kind of a snapshot. This is not to be very thorough about it, but the basic issue is that what I would say from this kind of information is that basically all of reality, all of life on Earth comes from, like, if you will, a certain type of what I would call a certain common soup of of matter, if you will. That all of us, all plants, animals, and humans, whatever, come from a certain thing, to the point to where there's certain genetic similarities that we have, amongst other human beings, between and human beings and animals, plants, things like that. So I would just say it's like a genetic soup that we all have a common genetic soup ancestor. And on some level, there's the idea that, for example, all of us are made of like stardust. That, basically for life to rise on this planet, when the planet was being formed, that there are elements of, of like stars that were found on the planet. And thus when, animals and plants and things like that and humans came about, we're a part of that also. So this is the way that I approach the idea of evolution, especially dealing with something prior to like modern humanity, where we can look and say, okay, well, like let's say I have a picture of my great great grandfather. Well, I can say probably in the last like several hundred years, because of different artist pictures and things like that, that humanity in the last number of generations, I would say probably the last, 5 to 6,000 years, has been something common to humanity of the modern day. So that I can pretty much say. But when you start getting past, like, let's say, I don't know, the point where you can find something that with bones and skin on it, that it's the question of what it was exactly would be where I just say question mark. I don't try to like say, okay, well, here's a monkey, it turns into this, it turns into that, it turns into that. No, my honesty would make me to say, we don't know what that looks like. We have no idea. If you took any human being on the planet and went backwards, what thing you would find that is basically they descend from directly. And not like, an idea where genetically we're similar, because we saw that in the previous slide. You could say, well, mice, were our ancestors mice? If we have a close DNA, like makeup to mice, were they chimpanzees? Well, of course not. You could say that, mice, chimpanzees, and humans, come from a common something. Whatever that something is, question mark, question mark, question mark. So let's try that out. Let's take this example. Here's a set of bones. Someone digs in the ground, finds this set of bones. So one of the questions I would have is that sometimes you see, I've kind of seen people who talk like this, and they say, "Wow, this is our ancestor from, this is the human ancestor from, millions of years ago." And again, I'm not saying it's impossible, but what I would question is, well, wait a minute, how do you know that's my direct ancestor? Maybe it's my cousin from, millions of years ago, but that doesn't mean it because you found it in the ground and it has like, bones that looks kind of human-like, doesn't mean that that's my ancestor. I mean, there's a lot of things you'd have to answer before you can get to that being my ancestor. And I'll talk about what I mean by that. Consider the following. You have some modern humans, like let's say gorilla and a chimpanzee looking at a skull, and everybody's like, Dad? And the basic idea is that, if we all come from, like, let's say a common ancestor, the question is, okay, well, how do we know that? How do we know how that works? It could be that we come from the same genetic soup, whatever that would mean. But, a skull on the ground doesn't exactly answer for us exactly how you get from to this guy, to this guy, to this girl, to the, the gorilla, to the chimpanzee. It's not impossible. Just the question is, I need to know how we get here, for example. So this brings up the kind of questions I'd be asking in a conversation about the results. You know, what kind of species do these bones belong to? This here. And, who gets to decide, what to call this as a species? Who gets to decide that it's correct to say it's like human, or even the definitions of species that we use? Who gets to decide those things? The next thing I would say is, what evidence is there that any modern human descends from the owner of these bones? Meaning that if you go back to whenever the thing that these bones come from was alive and walking around, what evidence do we have that it ever produced children? And that if it did produce children, that any of its children survived into the modern era, and that lastly, that any modern human descends from its descendants, if you will. And another question is, like I said before, who gets to define what type of terms are used to describe this? I mean, I don't have a problem with saying it's bones, but again, the issue is like, well, what is it exactly? I don't know. I mean, what things will allow me to know what I can call this, for example? So, I mean, for example, like, let's say I decide to call it grandfather. I mean, grandfather in English means a certain thing. Obviously, it's not my grandfather if these bones are like, let's say, millions of years old. Now, you could say, well, okay, it was your grandfather from several million years ago. Well, does DNA testing, for example, allow me to know that that's my grandfather from a million years ago? Or does DNA testing simply say that you and this thing have a common genetic makeup or structure, or even that you both share a similar genetic ancestry? Which could mean a lot of different things. It could mean that it's my, let's say, uncle from several million years ago, but that that my father or its brother looks completely different than what I would think, or completely different than me, or similar to me. There's a lot of different questions that could come up with that. So this gets back into what I was saying earlier. When you have these kind of debates, the first thing I would say is I try to establish terminology because I've had situations where I was discussing with someone who was an atheist about evolution, and I'm literally saying the same exact things that they're saying, but because they have an religious lean to them, they're looking for any way to try to argue with me about something where I'm like, look, we agree. I 100% agree with what you're saying. I mean, and, to here on these points here and here, we may disagree about the results, but as scientists, scientists are going to disagree about the results in some cases if it isn't proven to be the case. So that's one of the things I would say. And then there's some situations where I could hear someone who's like, let's say, a creationist and say, yeah, I don't agree with that. Yeah, I don't agree. I don't agree with that at all. And that's my personal position, but I don't see any evidence for that. And I can find an atheist who's a scientist or whatever who may say something, and I'm like, well, I don't know if I see that that's the evidence points to that. I mean, I can see what you're saying as a theory or an idea, and there's nothing wrong with having a theory and idea, but I don't see the evidence pointing towards that to where it's a proven fact. Because again, as I said before, you look at the idea, of modern humans and modern apes and things like that. We know, from realistically speaking, that modern humans and modern humans don't descend from gorillas and chimpanzees. We know that. The basic idea that exists within science is that if you look genetically speaking, that the variation between humans and what's considered to be some of the the great apes, there's a definition that humans fall into a certain category along with gorillas and chimpanzees. But then again, if you look at the difference genetically, people say there's like a 2% difference between, like, let's say, chimpanzees and humans, but that 2% is huge. I mean, the difference, if you look between a human in terms of its intellect, in terms of its physical capabilities, it's completely off the scale different than like a chimpanzee. Now again, that doesn't mean that humans and chimpanzees, if you will, if genetically speaking, that they don't share a certain commonality in the ancestry side of things. But the question would be, okay, well, what was it, if anything at all? If everything comes from a certain genetic soup, again, I'm using this term kind of loose and fast, you know, who's to say exactly what that was historically? And that's where the challenge we face in the modern time is that, for example, we have, ideas about things, but because we weren't there to see these things happening, and this is where I think the fallacy of the kind of the missing link comes in, that, there's this thing where people say, okay, well, you can't prove there's a connection between humans and, let's say, chimpanzees and gorillas, because you don't have a link between them. You don't have like that common thing that went from one thing to the other. And I think a lot of that happens because people are looking and saying, you're trying to say that my ancestors were these guys here, where a different approach would be, well, all of these, like, if you will, types of, you know, species or whatever you want to call them, separated from, a certain point and went their own way. Now, what they came from, we don't know, because we don't know what it is. And again, it's only an idea that we have that maybe they ancestrally came from something, rather than whatever formed life as it is, having, like, let's say, a common blueprint for, elements of life. And again, these are all questions and ideas, for example. This is not something where I'm saying I'm like closed on some of these things. It just depends on what's proven to be true. And there's certain areas and certain times in history you can say, look, I don't have any proof. I just have, the research we've done. It seems to point towards this, and this is what appears. But, again, we have to be realistic. Nobody is saying that humans modernly, and chimpanzees and gorillas modernly came from a gorilla or a chimpanzee. That's not what scientists are saying based on research. But again, sometimes there are people who kind of like, I would say, even atheists who kind of promote this idea, promote that being the idea that humans descend from something that was more ape-like, when who, for all anybody knows, maybe all of what came, first was something that was more human-like than anything else. We don't know. And people will say, "Oh, someone might say, you're trying to talk about de-evolution." Well, I'm not using that term at all. And I would say I'm not even using either term in that case. I'm just saying that something, gave way ancestrally to what exists modernly. How it happened or what that happened, I'd have to have proof of for my ideas just as much as the next guy. So not evolution, not de-evolution, but being that something changed to something. So it's not like something devolved, it just simply evolved in a certain pathway. That's the way I would probably say for myself. And in Hebrew, I would even describe these things differently than I do in English. So in summary, from a Torath Mosheh Jewish perspective, there are certain facts that we go by. There are certain ground facts, foundational facts. The Torah was given at Mount Sinai by the Creator of all things, and that produced the written Torah and the oral Torah as we have it. And that essentially there are areas where the written Torah and the oral Torah were never meant to try to like deal with the particulars of certain things. That they have like certain like foundational messages to them. So when it comes to the idea of, okay, well, how did modern humanity come about? Well, I would say no matter how the practical, the details came about, the creator of all things was the one who put all the things in place for that to happen. So there is no need for me to like say, okay, just because, science says this, well, science can't say something. Science is an idea. It's something that people do. It's not like it's some entity out there, doing this and that, but it's more like saying I may disagree with the conclusions that someone may have come to. I may, have questions about some of the results of the research. And it could be that in 1,000 years, somebody looks back and say, "Oh, all of you were crazy. You were all superstitious and backwards. You didn't know A, B, C, and D." It could be that someone in the future develops something to where they know historically better what happened than we do modernly. It could be that discoveries give us a better idea. And that's the idea that the creator of all things planted us here. And this is something I covered in my other videos on science, that the creator of all things planted us here to to research, to investigate the reality that surrounds us. And there's nothing wrong with things that challenge the ideas that we have, or even help elucidate the things that we believe. And that the Torah itself again was not meant to contradict what is known in reality. So I would say that more than anything else, there's no contradiction there between concepts. Again, I may challenge the definitions, I may challenge the terminology, I may have questions about what the results actually say, but that's exactly how you do things in science, and that's exactly what the Torah allows us to do. So you could have a Torah-based Jew say, "I don't believe in evolution at all," or you could someone say, "I don't believe in macroevolution, I believe in microevolution." You could have someone say, "Okay, well, I believe in whatever is proven to be true." So this is Ahav Ever from the Chronicles of Ahav Ever. Thank you for listening, and I'll probably do another video specifically focused on what humanity is according to the Torah. Thank you, and bye.